Welcome to the store. Don't forget to subscribe, and support me.
Time was a currency, more valuable than gold, more precious than water. Those who controlled it ruled the world, and those without it withered away into nothingness. Humanity had long been under the grip of the time mages, a powerful order that had discovered how to manipulate time itself. They could extend life or shorten it, speed up moments or slow them to an unbearable crawl. For centuries, they had used this mastery to reign over society, hoarding time as others would hoard wealth. Philip had always known the unfairness of their rule. As a child, he had watched his father toil in the factories, exchanging what little money he earned for a few extra months of life. When his mother fell ill, she had refused to seek the time mage's aid, unwilling to mortgage the family's future for a temporary extension. Her time had run out quickly. Philip still remembered the hollowness of the final seconds of her life, ticking away as if counted by the universe itself. Now, years later, Philip stood on the brink of something revolutionary. The flickering light of the underground lab he worked in cast long shadows across the room, but it was the machine in front of him that held his attention. Its polished metal glinted under the bare bulb, a mix of wires, gears, and energy pulses, a culmination of years of secret work. If it succeeded, it would break the time mage's grip on humanity. If it failed, it could very well destroy him. Philip adjusted the final dial, his hand trembling slightly. He couldn't afford to hesitate. The machine was designed to interact with time's natural flow, to bypass the artificial control the time mages had implemented. If it worked, it would free humanity from their dependency on the mages, allowing people to live according to the natural rhythms of time again. He exhaled sharply and activated the device. A hum filled the air, growing louder and more intense. For a moment, everything seemed frozen, as though time itself were holding its breath. Philip's heart raced as he watched the readings on the machine's display panel. The numbers fluctuated wildly, then suddenly stabilized. A surge of energy shot through him. It was working. The moment was broken by a knock on the door, sharp and urgent. Philip's pulse quickened as he rushed to shut off the machine. He grabbed a cloth and hastily covered it before opening the door a crack. "Philip," came a familiar voice. It was Lena, her eyes wide with worry. "They're looking for you. The time mages, they know." The blood drained from his face. "What do you mean?" "They've sensed something. There's been an anomaly, ripples in time. They're sending out patrols to investigate, and I heard your name. You have to leave, now." Philip felt a cold dread settle over him. He had been careful, excruciatingly so. But the time mages were ancient and powerful, and their mastery of time meant they could detect even the slightest disruption in its flow. "I'm not ready," Philip muttered, his mind racing. "The machine. I haven't had enough time to." "You don't have time," Lena interrupted, her voice urgent. "We have to go before they find you." For a moment, Philip considered dismantling the machine, hiding it, but he knew there was no point. The time mages would find him eventually. He glanced back at the covered device, the symbol of everything he had worked for, and a part of him wanted to stay and fight. But not yet. He wasn't ready to face them head-on, not without more preparation. Philip grabbed his coat, his mind already planning his next move. "Let's go," he said, following Lena out of the lab and into the winding, dark alleys of the underground city. They had barely made it a block when they heard the distant hum of the patrols. The sound of time itself bending under their control, a sickening pulse in the air. Philip quickened his pace, pulling Lena with him through the maze of streets. The city, always bleak under the time mage's rule, felt even more oppressive now. The thought of their powers was terrifying. they could slow time to catch him, or speed it up to age him into dust before he could escape, but the machine had worked. Philip clung to that thought. He had proof now, and with that proof came hope. For years, people had believed the time mage's control over time was absolute, but Philip had found a way to break their monopoly. He wasn't alone in this fight. The underground resistance had existed in whispers for decades. People who resented the time mages, who longed for freedom, but no one had been able to challenge them, until now. Philip knew he needed to get to the resistance leaders. If he could show them the machine, if he could prove that they could control their own time, he might be able to spark a rebellion. They ducked into an abandoned building, crouching behind debris as a patrol passed by. Philip could feel the air shift as the patrol moved, a nauseating sensation like the world tilting on its axis. They were bending time, searching for anomalies. "They know we're close," Lena whispered, her face pale. "We just need to reach the old tunnels," Philip replied, his voice tense. "They won't follow us there." The old tunnels were a network of forgotten underground pathways, long abandoned after the time mages had seized control. The resistance had turned them into safe havens, hidden from the mages' surveillance. It was the only place they could regroup, plan their next move. They waited until the patrol had passed before making their way down a narrow side street, slipping through a rusted metal door into the tunnels below. The air was cool and damp, but the oppressive weight of the time mage's control felt lighter here. Philip and Lena made their way deeper into the tunnels, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls. As they descended, the hum of the patrols faded, replaced by the quiet murmur of the underground. They reached a makeshift barricade, where a few guards, part of the resistance, stood watch. Their faces hardened at the sight of Philip and Lena, but they stepped aside when Lena gave a nod. Inside the main chamber, a group of resistance leaders were gathered, their expressions grim. Among them was Tyrus, a hardened veteran who had spent his life fighting the time mages, though always from the shadows. "Philip," Tyrus said, his voice rough with years of battle. "We heard about the anomalies. Is it true?" Philip hesitated, then nodded. "It's true. I've built something. A machine that can break their control. It worked. I've already used it." The room fell silent. The resistance had hoped for a weapon, something tangible, something that could turn the tide in their favor. But a machine that could control time? It was beyond what anyone had imagined. Tyrus narrowed his eyes, stepping closer. "If you're telling the truth, this changes everything. But it's dangerous. The mages won't stop hunting you now. You've disrupted their control. They'll stop at nothing to find you." "I know," Philip replied, his voice steady. "But this is our chance. If we can mass-produce the machine, we can free people. We can make it so they don't have to rely on the mages for time anymore. We can take back control." A murmur of excitement rippled through the group, but Tyrus remained cautious. "Even if we have the machines, we're still outnumbered. The mages are powerful. They've ruled for centuries. We need more than just a device. We need a plan." Philip clenched his fists. "I've thought about that. We don't need to fight them head-on. We can strike at their infrastructure, disrupt their operations, weaken them from within. If we can get enough people to rise up, the mages won't be able to control everyone at once." Philip's mind raced as Tyrus's cautious words hung in the air. He had expected resistance to the plan, but the tension in the room was thick with doubt and uncertainty. Still, the idea of sitting back, waiting for the time mages to find them, gnawed at him. He glanced around the dimly lit chamber, meeting the eyes of the resistance members who were staring at him with a mixture of hope and wariness. This was the moment to decide, whether to strike now or wait for the perfect moment, one that might never come. Lena stepped forward, her voice soft but firm. We can't afford to wait much longer. The mages are already aware that something's changed. Every second we delay is another second they have to regroup, to tighten their control. Philip's machine is the key to breaking their hold. Tyrasa's gaze shifted between Philip and Lena. After a long silence, he let out a heavy sigh. If we do this, we do it fast. We target their life centers, the places where they manipulate time, where they harvest it. If we can destroy those, the mages lose their ability to control time for the masses. Philip nodded, heart pounding. We'll need to get the machine to as many resistance cells as possible. Once people are free of the mages' time control, they'll fight. They won't have a choice, they'll see the truth. Tyrus stepped closer, his voice lowering. Are you sure your machine will work on a larger scale? What you did was impressive, but the time mages have centuries of experience. They know time better than we know ourselves. Philip took a deep breath, his mind flashing back to the moment the machine had first hummed to life, to the instant he had felt time loosen its grip on him. He had never been more certain of anything in his life. It will work, he said, steady and resolute. We can take back time. There was no turning back now. Within hours, the resistance was mobilizing. Teams of engineers and fighters gathered in hidden corners of the underground city, each team carrying a version of Philip's machine, hastily assembled from the plans he had provided. The Resistance's network, long dormant, was suddenly alive with activity. Word spread like wildfire through the tunnels and secret meeting points. They were going to strike at dawn. Philip's heart raced with anticipation and fear as he watched the preparations. Every minute felt like an eternity, and yet, in a few short hours, everything would change. The time mages wouldn't just retaliate, they would come down with all their might. If they failed, there wouldn't be another chance. Lena found him standing alone in one of the corridors, staring at a map of the city's infrastructure. She touched his shoulder lightly, and he turned to face her. You look like you've seen the future, she said with a small smile, though her eyes betrayed her own worry. Philip shrugged, forcing a smile back. I've always been good at fixing things. But this is bigger than anything I've ever done. What if I've miscalculated? What if the machine can't withstand the scale? Lena stepped closer, her voice soft but filled with conviction. You built this machine. You've given people hope. That's more than any of us could have asked for. Whatever happens, you've already changed the world. Her words steadied him, and for a moment, the doubt cleared from his mind. He nodded, his resolve hardening. You're right. We can't stop now. At dawn, the strike began. The first explosion ripped through the central life center, sending shockwaves through the city. Smoke billowed into the sky, and the time mages were immediately alerted. Within seconds, time patrols were dispatched, their twisted manipulation of time bending reality as they surged toward the Resistance's hidden bases, but the Resistance was ready. Philip's machines had been distributed throughout the city, and at key locations, the devices were activated. People who had been under the mages' control for years felt the grip of time release them. Lifespans that had been shortened, paused, or extended unnaturally snapped back into their natural rhythm. The chaos that followed was unimaginable. For the first time in centuries, the people of the city were free of the time mage's influence. Philip was at the heart of it all. He and Lena had positioned themselves at a key underground junction, one of the central hubs where they could oversee the operation. The sound of explosions and shouts echoed through the tunnels, and the air was thick with tension. But Philip's machine continued to work, freeing people one by one, unshackling them from the mage's tyranny. As the resistance gained ground, the time mages responded with ferocity. The Grand Mage, a figure as old as time itself, appeared at the front lines, his eyes glowing with a terrifying power. He raised his hands, and the very air around him warped and twisted. Time slowed to a crawl in his immediate vicinity, freezing resistance fighters in mid-motion. Philip saw the Grand Mage from a distance, his heart sinking. This was the true extent of the Time Mage's power, a raw, primal force that Philip had only begun to understand. The Grand Mage was not simply manipulating time, he was time, its living embodiment. Lena's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. "Philip, we need to fall back. We can't fight him like this." But Philip shook his head. "If we retreat now, we lose everything. The people lose everything." In that moment, Philip knew what he had to do. The machine was powerful, but it wasn't enough to defeat the Grand Mage. Not yet. He needed to take a risk, one that might cost him his life but could save countless others. Grabbing the device, he began to adjust the settings, his fingers moving quickly over the controls. Lena stared at him in shock. "What are you doing?" Philip didn't answer at first. He focused on recalibrating the machine, increasing its power output far beyond what it had been designed to handle. The machine hummed louder, vibrating in his hands. "I'm going to use the machine on myself," he said finally, his voice low but determined. "I'm going to confront the Grand Mage. If I can disrupt his control of time, even for a moment, it might be enough for the resistance to strike." Lena's eyes widened. "Philip, that's insane. You'll die." "I have to try," he replied, his voice steady. "This is bigger than me. It's bigger than all of us." Before she could protest further, Philip activated the machine. A surge of energy shot through him, and he felt time ripple around him, bending to his will. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced. His body felt lighter, his senses heightened. For the first time, he was in control of time, not the mage's. With a final glance at Lena, Philip rushed toward the battlefield, where the Grand Mage stood, surrounded by his slowing vortex of time. The resistance fighters were frozen, their weapons mid-swing, caught in the mage's temporal trap. Philip approached the Grand Mage, feeling the weight of time pressing down on him. But his machine held, cutting through the mage's power, giving Philip a narrow window to act. The Grand Mage turned, his ancient eyes locking onto Philip. There was a flicker of surprise in those eyes, an emotion the mage hadn't felt in centuries. "You dare challenge me?" the Grand Mage's voice boomed, echoing through time itself. Philip's machine buzzed in response, and he raised it toward the mage. "You've controlled time for too long," Philip shouted. "It's over." The Grand Mage sneered, lifting his hand to unleash a wave of temporal energy, but Philip was faster. His machine pulsed, sending a shock wave of time energy crashing into the mage. The Grand Mage staggered, his control faltering for a split second. In that moment, the resistance fighters broke free from the time trap. They surged forward, overwhelming the mage's forces. Philip pressed forward, feeling the strain on his body as the machine consumed more and more energy. His lifespan was shrinking with every second, but he didn't care. He had to end this. The Grand Mage, realizing he was losing control, lashed out in fury, bending time around him in a final desperate attempt to regain his power. But Philip stood firm, the machine whirring in his hands, tearing down the mage's manipulation of time. With one final pulse, Philip unleashed the full power of the machine. Time itself seemed to shatter around the Grand Mage, the ancient force unraveling as the mage let out a cry of rage and fear. Then, in a blinding flash of light, the Grand Mage was gone, erased from time itself. The battlefield fell silent. The resistance fighters stood in stunned disbelief as the realization set in. The Time Mage's rule was over. Time was free. Philip collapsed to the ground, his strength spent. Lena was by his side in an instant, tears streaming down her face. "You did it," she whispered, holding him tightly. "You saved us." Philip smiled weakly, his vision fading. "We saved ourselves," he murmured. "Time belongs to us now." As the sun rose over the city, the people of the world emerged from the shadows, their lives their own once more. The era of the Time Mages had ended. And with it, a new era began, one where time was no longer a weapon, but a gift.